KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. The world's largest wildlife overpass will soon be open for use in Colorado. Wildlife overpasses allow animals to safely cross over highways. And Western states are building more of these to cut down on the number of crashes between vehicles and animals. This new overpass is being constructed over a section of I-25 between Denver and Colorado Springs, just north of Monument. Some 80,000 drivers pass through this area daily. But elk, mule deer, and pronghorn also use that area to move between the mountains and the plains. So this stretch of highway averages one vehicle crash involving wildlife every day. So could this overpass help improve migration patterns and reduce the number of crashes? Nikki Fry is a wildlife specialist with Utah State University Extension who studies wildlife overpasses in the West, but was not involved in planning this one. She joined me to explain how they work and why they're important to wildlife in the ecosystem.
There's a lot of complex reasons. The overarching reason is that those migrations allow the animals to get to the food and the water and the shelter that they need during that season. So if they can't get to that, then they're not healthy, they can't reproduce. Also, a lot of those areas are where they congregate to do some of the breeding. So if they can't get there, we also see sort of a genetic drift or a genetic isolation. So all those genes aren't transferring like they used to be before we had that barrier in place. So in some populations that are isolated, you see genetic issues because they just can't transfer that material.
Wow.
And then you have to deal with the habitat gets damaged because you have too many animals hanging out in that one place.
Let's get to this new overpass then. This will measure 200 feet wide, which is about 6 lanes of traffic, making it the largest overpass in the world, right here in Colorado. What makes this area so unique that it requires such a large overpass?
What is unique about the area is that it does have migration occurring from multiple ungulates. So you have deer and elk that are trying to cross this area, sometimes pronghorn. And elk in particular, they're very reluctant to use an overpass. But if you use an overpass that's wide enough to convince them that it's really just part of the natural landscape, they'll very quickly learn to use that overpass. So that can facilitate a speedy migration, and it can also facilitate the elk coming over in larger numbers because more of them will feel more comfortable going across it. So the wider it is, the more you can have it just fit into the landscape and the wildlife just think it's part of the landscape.
And I want to dig more into animals learning to do this. I know that wild animals cannot be trained really to use overpasses. They can't read signs saying, oh, the overpass is this way. How do animals figure out how to use these?
Well, we do kind of train them a little bit in that on either side of the overpass, there's going to be a fence that they can't get over. And it usually goes in 2 miles on either side of the overpass and then on both sides of the highway.
Okay.
It sort of leads them in the right direction. And then they just kind of keep pushing up against that fence until they find the overpass. And then they gauge whether or not that's a risky decision or not. And if it's big and wide, like the one that we're building, they go, oh, perfect, here's a way across. And they just cross. And they may not even notice that the highway's there. They just like, oh, phew, there's no more fence. I can get across now. And then once they realize that they did that safely, they'll continue to come back to that place because that's a safe place to come. And then they teach their offspring to come to that place.
So it just builds.
It does, yep. Yep.
The Colorado Department of Transportation says the overpass will be completed this December. How long does it usually take for animals to make use of an overpass?
I suspect that an overpass that size, you'll see wildlife using that overpass within a couple months. Say you have 100 elk that are trying to cross. Once 1 or 2 start to go, then more and more and more go, and they kind of follow along pretty quickly. So I recently just finished a study in northern Utah along the I-80 corridor, where it crossed 8 lanes of traffic, but we had to create a very narrow corridor. So the overpass is about 1/10 of the width of the Colorado overpass, just so that we could fit it into the ecosystem. And this was designed to benefit moose and deer, particularly, that were getting hit pretty frequently on I-80. We used to joke that it was called the noodle. And even though it was that thin, we had moose and deer using it within 3 or 4 months of it being constructed. And I think it's just that the wildlife need that safe passage so badly that they're willing to take that first risk.
Nikki, I know you've looked a bit into the economic impacts of building overpasses like this one. The cost of this project is around $15 million to the state. How do states justify spending like that for something that most drivers won't even notice?
Well, they look at 2 things. They're going to look at what we call the cost of an elk or a deer being gone from the environment. And then they're going to look at the human cost of a human mortality or a human vehicle crash and the estimates of how that's going to be reduced. And so, for example, we can say, I'm just going to throw out a number, but they'll say elk are worth $1,000 to the ecosystem services and the economy. So people going hunting or people buying binoculars and providing that sales tax to the economy. Or the service of, just being part of the ecosystem. And so it's a loss of $1,000 every time one of those gets killed by a vehicle collision.
Right.
So that's one way. And then they're going to say, okay, every time a vehicle hits an elk, it's $5,000 worth of damage.
Sure.
And then, of course, the cost of a human life, which can't be measured at all. And so they can look at, over time, what the reduction is. So the Department of Transportation knows a really good estimate of how many collisions are happening. And then after a couple of years, they can say, this is the reduction in collisions. Do those calculations and show the cost savings both to the environment and to the human public.
So in a period of time, you could expect an overpass to pay for itself.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And I suspect that even though this seems like a really expensive overpass, I would suspect that within 5 to 10 years, it's paid for itself immediately, especially if we're getting a collision a day. I mean, that adds up.
Right.
In Banff, it's the next largest overpass that we have a lot of data on in Banff National Park. They estimate an 80% reduction in collisions.
Oh, wow. That's huge.
It's exactly. That's huge. And that's just in the deer and the elk and the large animals. If you start calculating the ecosystem cost to all the smaller animals that get hit that we don't even monitor, it really starts to add up. It's really beneficial.
Nikki Fry is a wildlife specialist with Utah State University Extension. We'll include a link in our show notes where you can learn more about what will be the world's largest wildlife overpass on I-25 near Monument. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.